Welcome to the InfoWars Nightly News. It is Tuesday, December 3rd, 2013. I'm Leanne McAdoo, and here's what's coming up tonight.
Tonight, the Amazon drone marketing scheme. Then, the war for energy. And Alex Jones calls to boycott the NFL. That's next on the InfoWars Nightly News.
I think I'm going to get on an airplane and go to where they're holding a stupid gladiatorial event. I mean, nothing against it. It's just guys bending over and guys put their hands down and then grab the ball, all pat each other and everything. So I think I shouldn't protest it because that's being anti-gay.
Well, everybody is talking about the grid these days. Energy officials are especially worried about the stability of this system as it's needed to carry electricity from place to place and also to spy on all of us Americans. We're constantly being reminded about how vulnerable the grid is to a freak storm or a terrorist attack or some hacker that's sophisticatedly hacked into the system from his mom's basement. Well, now they are telling us that the new struggle facing the grid is power itself, and specifically green energy. Experts say that as states race to bring more wind, solar, and geothermal power online, it's creating more anxiety for a grid that's designed for the previous century. Green energy is the least predictable kind. Nobody can say for certain when the wind will blow or the sun will shine. Solar panels might be cranking out huge amounts of energy one minute and then a tiny amount the next if a cloud arrives. So then the other big problem, of course, is energy storage. Power grid operators in some states have had to dump energy that's produced by wind turbines because they don't really have anywhere to store it. And they say it's getting to the point where we'll have to pay people not to produce power. Not to mention the fact that it takes tons of materials created via fossil fuels to actually build the wind turbines, as well as where are they going to put them all? And they don't even know if once they are approved, if regulators will then allow the lines that are necessary to carry electricity from place to place. They don't even, it's a mess. And tomorrow night, David Knight is going to get into greater detail about just how useless those renewables are to the grid in his interview with David Schneier. But for now, it really seems like they are trying to scrap renewables altogether. And at the very least, their PR campaign is struggling. We're already hearing from countries like Canada, who in their big rush toward renewable energies are reporting that their energy rates are actually increasing by 60%. And now that governments around the world have agreed to stop global warming by reducing coal power and energy sources like oil and natural gas by 80%, now what are we going to do? Their reduction plan assumes that we'll be able to compensate for the ever-increasing energy demand by making our homes and machines more and more efficient. Now, this vastly expanded grid, it's going to prove to be too expensive. It could generate local opposition. And as I mentioned, there's no way to store the energy for when it is actually needed. Well, Sally Benson, who heads the Global Climate and Energy Project at Stanford University, is teaching her students how to think about reducing emissions with all energy. You can't lose jobs at all those power plants after all. Well, remarkably, the conclusion that students came up with mirrors what a lot of experts have found when they look at this problem. They recommend capturing carbon dioxide from plants that burn fossil fuel and burying it underground. They also say that reducing the emissions would mean producing a substantial amount of nuclear power. Well, isn't that interesting? Because ever since Obama took office, he's really been pushing for nuclear power. And he reiterated that this year in his climate action plan. He said, thanks to the ingenuity of our businesses, we're starting to produce much more of our own energy. We're building the first nuclear power plants in more than 3 decades in Georgia and South Carolina. Obama also expressed support for the country's booming natural gas development while announcing that he would direct the Environmental Protection Agency to create pollution standards that would restrict power plant carbon emissions. And indeed, they are. The EPA's regulatory agenda for the fall of 2013 lists hundreds of pending energy and environmental regulations that are going to limit emissions from power plants, as well as give the EPA authority over water that's on private land. The EPA will set emission limits that are going to effectively ban the construction of new coal-fired power plants unless they use carbon capture and sequestration technology like those college kids recommended. And then next year, the agency will move to limit emissions from existing power plants, which could put more older coal plants out of commission. But what about those jobs? Those all-important jobs? Well, already EPA regulations have contributed to the closure of more than 300 coal units in 33 states. So he doesn't really care about coal plants. He just wants to keep those nuclear plant jobs flowing. Now, the EPA is also working on a rule that would expand the definition of waters of the U.S. under the Clean Water Act to include water on private property. Now, Texas Republican Lamar Smith said the EPA's draft water rule is a massive power grab of private property across the U.S., and it could be the largest expansion of EPA regulatory authority ever. The EPA says the rule is needed to clear up uncertainty left in the wake of a U.S. Supreme Court decisions on the agency's regulatory authority over bodies of water. So the Supreme Court ruled one way, and so the EPA and Obama are just, of course, true to form, going to interpret that ruling and that law the way they see fit, which is, you didn't actually mean that we don't have authority over water on private property, right? Because we do. And so now Obama and the EPA are going to be shutting down all the coal power plants. They're ramping up nuclear technology, doing away with renewable energies, forcing you to put smart meters on your home, and now they're going to be taking authority over water on your property. Sounds very socialist to me, but we all know that socialists can't keep the lights on. Just look at what's happening in Venezuela. Now, even though Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world and 2 hydroelectric facilities that generate 2/3 of its power, its socialist government appears incapable of meeting the rudimentary needs of the people. Some of those earlier blackouts were part of a rationing scheme by the government, while others were due to utility failures. The outages haven't affected the country's oil production facilities, of course, because those oil refineries are powered by separate generators. How convenient. Now, President Maduro suspects sabotage. After all, the outage did occur while he was delivering a live national address on television, which is just kind of wildly convenient to help support that sabotage theory, since the president had just given most of the country a free television for every home. And Maduro has used earlier outages as political fodder to attack his enemies. So is that the kind of political game playing that we can expect to see here with the grid? After all, we are continually being told how vulnerable our grid is to cyber attacks. So if you don't agree with me, oops, I'm sorry, your power went out. I can just see Obama playing that game, sort of like we saw when the government shut down and he just shut down all the national parks to make us feel the pain. I don't think he would have any problem flipping the switch on the nation's power grid. And I bet he cannot wait to get his fingers on the internet kill switch. Well, according to the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, chemtrails don't exist. And even though that they don't exist and they're not spraying the sky, they also say that in order to stop global warming, we absolutely mustn't stop doing it. They say if SRM were terminated for any reason, there is high confidence that global surface temperatures will rise very rapidly. Solar radiation management has 3 essential characteristics. It's cheap, fast, and imperfect. The IRGC explains that by injecting 13,000 tons of sulfate aerosol into the stratosphere on a daily basis, they would offset the radiative effects of a doubling of atmospheric CO2. And this compares to having to remove 225 million tons per day of CO2 from the atmosphere for 25 years. So heck, that sounds like we've solved the problem. No need to bury CO2. We can just block out the sun with this cheap, and imperfect plan that they've got in place. But in addition to warning the policymakers in its summary that chemtrails must continue, the IPCC also denies that such programs exist. Buried deep within Chapter 7, the IPCC simply states that SRM methods are unimplemented and untested. And that's odd, because I thought if we stopped, the planet would heat up. But the IPCC goes on to admit that a number of field experiments have already taken place. One of the programs listed, the Intercontinental Chemical Transport Experiment, covered the Northern Hemisphere. They were measuring aerosols that originated in Asia, crossing the Pacific into the North America, and then continuing across the Atlantic Ocean and into Europe. Another experiment ran for full 4 years, and it included Africa. And look, it even has a nice little logo there showing you what it was all about, spring 2006, but it doesn't actually exist. They never actually did that. It's a conspiracy theory, and if you think that they were actually spraying the sky to stop global warming, then you are a crazy conspiracy theorist. And of course, since they're not spraying the sky with solar radiation management, that's why they need nuclear energy, which is also a conspiracy theory to think that nuclear energy isn't the cleanest and the best out there. At least that's what they're telling us. And if you don't think so, well, here's proof. SmartPlanet.com says so. They say that nuclear is on par with geothermal, and it's virtually the same as wind. Now, they don't really specify if they're talking about a nice breeze on a Sunday or if they're speaking about a hurricane, but nevertheless, they think it's on par. And they go on to critique Germany, saying that Germany thinks it's okay to emit tens of megatons more of CO2 because they like coal better than nuclear. Well, remind us, how many Germans have died from nuclear power radiation? And what about Americans, the English, the French? Oh yes, all zero. And they continue on saying that renewable energies, we're not even talking about the vast tracts of land and sea that's taken for wind, nor are we talking about species threats, maintenance emissions, worker dangers, and even maritime dangers for offshore windmills. But even with all of that fancy propaganda and the failure of the mainstream media to report about Fukushima, the devastating effects of that nuclear meltdown cannot be ignored. Even the president of the company that runs Fukushima is speaking out. TEPCO's president said that the triple meltdown following the earthquake and tsunami in Japan was a warning to the world, and the nuclear industry must be prepared for the worst. He said that despite what the nuclear industry and the public wanted to believe, nuclear power was not 100% safe. We have to explain, no matter how small a possibility, what if this barrier is broken? We have to prepare a plan if something happens. It's easy to say that, almost nothing's perfect, so we don't have to worry about it, but we have to keep thinking, what if? And that's exactly true. What if? What if the hundreds of tons of nuclear waste that are dumping into the Pacific Ocean every day are killing 5 million birds off the coast of Australia, or causing radiation and radioactive isotopes to be found in fish off the coast of California and Canada? And what if all those melting starfish are suffering from radiation? It's not far-fetched to understand that radiation affects the nervous system, and starfish have a very primitive nervous system. But just like they told us that mercury in the vaccines is safe, now they're telling us that nuclear energy is also safe. Obama wants a new generation of nuclear power plants, but that doesn't mean clean nuclear power plants. No, it means just much of the same, because clean nuclear energy doesn't produce the weapons-grade byproduct that is necessary for the military-industrial complex to build their war machines. And there you have it. It's creating more anxiety for a grid that's designed for the previous century. Green energy is the least predictable kind. Nobody can say for certain when the wind will blow or the sun will shine. Solar panels might be cranking out huge amounts of energy one minute and then a tiny amount the next if a cloud arrives. So then the other big problem, of course, is energy storage. Power grid operators in some states have had to dump energy that's produced by wind turbines because Welcome to the InfoWars Nightly News. It is Tuesday, December 3rd, 2013. I'm Leanne McAdoo, and here's what's coming up tonight.
Tonight, the Amazon drone marketing scheme. Then, the war for energy. And Alex Jones calls to boycott the NFL. That's next on the InfoWars Nightly News.
I think I'm going to get on an airplane and go to where they're holding a stupid gladiatorial event. I mean, nothing against it. It's just guys bending over and guys put their hands down and then grab the ball and all pat each other and everything. So I think I shouldn't protest it because that's being anti-gay.
Well, everybody is talking about the grid these days. Energy officials are especially worried about the stability of this system as it's needed to carry electricity from place to place and also to spy on all of us Americans. We're constantly being reminded about how vulnerable the grid is to a freak storm or a terrorist attack or some hacker that's sophisticatedly hacked into the system from his mom's basement. Well, now they are telling us that the new struggle facing the grid is power itself, and specifically green energy. Experts say that as states race to bring more wind, solar, and geothermal power online,